Mana cannot precisely be described in materialistic or transcendental terms, but as magical terms are rather limited in our culture, it is worth attempting these descriptions. Mana, in materialistic terms, is the information which structures matter, and which all matter and thought is capable of emitting and receiving across space and perhaps time. Mana, in transcendental terms, is a sort of life force present to some degree in all beings, objects and events, and able to act between them. In magical terms, mana is the power which shapes phenomena, and which phenomena emit to shape other phenomena. It is also knowledge, in the sense that the shaping power imparts information. Mana is not synonymous with consciousness in the transcendental sense. Consciousness is no more than a word used to describe the sensation arising from mental activity. Mana is analogous to spirit only to the extent that spirit is taken to imply communicated information. Mana is not an attribute of matter, rather it is the other way round. Matter is the way in which mana most commonly appears to us. The so-called scientific laws of the material universe are an expression of mana. From a magical point of view, the laws of nature are incomplete. Future events are not entirely determined in advance. Mana acts chaotically within those arbitrary limits it has already invented. Thus mana is creative and unpredictable in those situations where there are insufficient mana conventions to determine what will happen. And this includes everything more complex than clockwork. And it is here that magic or mana projection can be used to force the hand of chance. Divination must always be difficult or subject to large inaccuracies, because many aspects of the future are indeterminate. The decision to develop one's psychic powers primarily for enchantment, which is making things happen, rather than for divination, is a large part of actually becoming a magician. At many points in its history, magic has been heavily contaminated with mystical and religious beliefs. The term chaos magic is used to designate a philosophy of pure magic, unadulterated with transcendentalism. There are two basic principles underlying it, and these give structure to the magician's identity. The first is that mana is spontaneously self-creative. Mana creates itself in the manifestation of phenomena and events, and having created arbitrarily, tends to stick to a pattern. Thus the universe is arbitrary within arbitrary limits. There are ultimately no reasons for the laws of the universe. They arise chaotically and take on the appearance of causality by repetition. Now these arbitrary limits are less confining than most people think. The sun will rise and water will still run downhill tomorrow, but much of what will happen is at this moment still undecided. For the magician, the core of the microcosm and macrocosm doctrine is that man and the universe are both based on the random, chaotically creative powers of mana, and that both have considerable power to exercise that freedom. Thus, in the magical paradigm, there is no need to debate free will versus determinism. Any sufficiently complicated system will exhibit some random behavior, and if we choose to identify with our random behavior and call it free will, then we should be prepared to affirm that the weather, for example, also has a degree of free will. All this soon leads the magician to the recognition that it is he who has effectively created much of his own universe by investing or withdrawing meaning or belief in various parts of the surrounding reality. This is likely to lead the magician, particularly the younger magician, into some fairly extreme forms of behavior as he tests his mana against that of the arbitrary conventions in the environment. A certain perversity, iconoclasm, and antinomianism is likely to colour his extreme individualism. He is as likely to experimentally deify some rough-hewn fetish as he is to desecrate what others hold sacred. To survive in this mode requires a considerable lightness of touch. A huge sense of humour is all that stands between the magician and social ostracism or madness. He would be the first to proclaim that when the possibilities of common sense prove insufficient, one can often make nonsense deliver the goods. The second core principle of Magick is also subsumed within the microcosm and macrocosm doctrine. Because mana penetrates everywhere, all parts reflect the whole, and the magician is at least potentially in instantaneous two-way contact with all phenomena. In practice, a magical link is required. The magician must possess some image or memory or a connection to some material substance through which mana can operate. Mana operates between phenomena of similar type. Transmitter and receiver must share common characteristics. Like attracts like. The magician aims to establish certain symmetries between the inner and outer landscapes. Being aware that mana is playing a game with itself and making up the rules, prizes and forfeits as it goes along, he decides that it would be more fun if he were to cheat a little himself. To do this, he must first prepare his internal landscape. It is basically the great variety of methods of preparing the internal landscape, which accounts for the rich diversity of magical identities and magical symbol systems. The practice of visualization is basic to them all, however. Visualization should also be understood to include intense ideation, sustained emotion, and other forms of mental focusing, concentration, and imagination. It is a state bordering on hysteria in the clinical sense, where the whole of the attention is directed towards some particular focus. It is usefully augmented by various physiological practices, ranging from sensory deprivation to frenzied ecstasy, that are collectively known as methods of attaining single-pointed awareness, or gnosis. The oldest magical systems, known as shamanism, populated the internal landscape with the spirits of natural phenomena, diseases, plants, and particularly animals, in an attempt to gain control over these phenomena. Nowadays, a number of neo-shaman practice identification with animal form, not so much for hunting purposes, but as a gateway to gnosis in which to perform other magics. In religious periods, magicians have usually filled their internal landscapes with angelic or demonic images. Each entity would have some specific function in the world, and each wizard would have a grimoire detailing the connections he had forged between the parts of his inner landscape, conceptualized as entities, and the outer landscape, the world. In their Baroque symbolism, both the shaman and the goetic theurgic traditions reflect the fact that it is considerably easier to handle the internal landscape if one fills it up with spectacular and emotive artifacts. The continuing popularity of Satanism amongst agnostics is testimony enough to this. There is some reality to the tradition of demonic pacts. Whatever is accepted into the internal landscape becomes part of you and will grow if fed. There is always a danger that design faults in an internal landscape lead to a progressive detachment from the external landscape. Then he who would be a magician ends up merely as an internal landscape gardener, or mystic, as he usually dignifies himself. Modern Kabbalah, in which I include the whole vast overflown edifice of correspondences between archaic pantheons, metals, plants, stones, tarot and astrology, can often be more of an obstruction than an aid to magic. Those who attempt to use the system in its entirety tend to be too preoccupied with patching incongruent maps to each other and to their experience of the outer landscape to actually do much effective magic.